and welcome you for our first keynote speech that's happening tonight from our wonderful Dr. Meghan Kirkwood. And she is going to talk a little bit about, well, our theme for this year is social equity and representation. And so we're excited to have her with us for a few talks throughout the week. And I'll tell you a little bit later about some other events that are happening for the week. I'm going to read a quick bio from her and share a little bit about her, who she is, and why we have her with us on campus this week. So Meghan is an assistant professor of visual arts at Washington University in St. Louis, where she teaches photography. She earned a BFA from Rhode Island School of Design and Photography before completing her MFA in studio art at Tulane University. She has received numerous fellowships, including funding to participate in artist residencies through the National Parks Service, the Vermont Studio Center, and Lakeside Lab in Iowa. Her photography has been exhibited throughout the United States, Europe, and Africa. Dr. Kirkwood's photography interests concentrate on landscape photography and the ways artists' representations of land help generate and sustain values and attitudes towards the natural environment. In tandem with her studio practices, Kirkwood also researches in the fields of African art and the history of photography. And she holds a MA in art history from University of Kansas, where she researches African monuments designed and built by North Koreans, and a PhD in art history from the University of Florida. Her dissertation examines the uses of landscape imagery by contemporary South African photographers. She's a native of New England, a native New Englander, and has lived in and worked in various states in the South and Midwest. She has also lived abroad for extended periods in Argentina, Germany, South Africa, and when not for photographing or traveling, Kirkwood trains for and competes in marathons. We're presenting her on behalf of the Visual and Performing Arts, Pavlis Honors College, as well as partial funding by the Visiting Professor Program, which is funded by a grant to the Office of the Provost from the State of Michigan King Chavez Parks Initiative. Her talk today is the importance of community discovery and obligation, strategies for successful project, service learning, and global experiences. So we're excited to have her with us tonight. Thank you all for coming, and I will pass over the time for now to Dr. Kirkwood.
Okay, we're good. Great. All right, well, Dar, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here virtually with everybody, and feel really honored to have the chance to share some of my work and some strategies with you. I'm just really excited to be here, especially at the beginning of such a really exciting conference. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the projects that I'm doing, and then talk more specifically about some of the work that is in the gallery and is on campus currently. Okay. So Star mentioned my bio. I'm originally from New England. I've spent pretty much all of my life before I went to college in New Hampshire. And that was a really great experience I had growing up there, but it was one that was pretty specific and very rooted to a specific given place. The only time that I really left New Hampshire was when I was in high school, and I did a study abroad program in Argentina. And that was the first time in my life I had been somewhere where I didn't speak the language. Where I couldn't really communicate very easily with other people, and where I was kind of without any of the resources that I had to kind of, in New England navigate my position and my place. But it was that period for me that really turned me into a photographer, and made me very interested in thinking about how place and culture and visuals of the culture all intertwine with each other. So I spent so much time not being able to talk that I really had to kind of rely on being able to look and observe and learn about a place just by seeing and listening. And so that made me very interested in ways that photography specifically could kind of mimic experiences that I had learning about a place. So that was kind of how I got started in working and moving down this path. But yeah, so also as far as now fast forward through quite a few years, now I live and work in St. Louis. And I teach at the university, or excuse me, at Washington University in St. Louis, where I'm working with photography students and students from across the campus that have really different interests and majors to do various photo projects. And one of the things that I'm doing there now and spending a lot of time doing is working with aerial imaging and working with drones and using drones as a way to connect to different communities in St. Louis. One of the most interesting things about working in this way and using it as a tool to connect with different communities is that it brings up all these different photographic situations that spur other conversations. So when we photograph and we're using a drone and we're flying 400 feet above the ground, how does it change the power dynamics of what we're seeing and representing? How do we connect that back to our discussions about place or how we want to use the images? So it's becoming a really interesting and fruitful place to be working. Yeah, and then yeah, so finally, as Dara was saying too, another part of my background I wanted to just highlight before I got started talking about some projects was my work in South Africa. This is stuff that has been really important to me, both as a photographer and as a researcher. So my work in South Africa looks at landscape photography and how South African photographers are representing spaces. And I'm looking specifically at artists who are working in a post-1994, so after the end of apartheid, and really trying to think about what it means to depict a space, depict all of the different social relationships that are happening in that space, and use photography as a way to start having conversations between different groups in South Africa about history, about access to space, about engagement with each other. But yeah, so aside from teaching and researching, most of my work now is just centered on landscape photography. So I started really getting interested in landscapes and using landscapes as a tool to investigate places and stories about places, building stories about places when I was in graduate school. So I went to Tulane University and I moved there right after Hurricane Katrina happened. And it was a really interesting and very difficult time to be in New Orleans. And it was a very profoundly impacting experience for me and for my work. And so while I was there, I started working on a long-term project that was looking at a specific neighborhood outside of the city that had been really negatively impacted by the storm. So I'm just going to show you a little map here. So this was a neighborhood in Chalmette, Louisiana, which was right adjacent to the Lower Ninth Ward. And I became really interested in this specific area because it was a place where most of the people that lived there were working in the city, but were renting. So it was an area that was primarily different apartment buildings, retail spaces, but not a ton of single family homes. And it was a community that was really particularly negatively impacted by the storm because there wasn't the same different types of support programs to help renters and low-income people that there were for other parts of the city. And so what you saw driving around these areas was places that even years after the storm had just kind of been left. And so for me, as someone who was interested in landscape photography and also documentary photography, I really, I became interested in photographing this space and thinking about how these photographs, how I could photograph in different increments over time as a way to talk about what an aftermath looked like for a community that couldn't that couldn't be represented anymore. So I started photographing there regularly in 2007 and 2009. And so at first it was photographing different buildings that were there, different views of this, of more or less what was like a 2 square mile area. And then I came back there just about every 2 years since then. And it's been a chance to photograph and document what's been happening in the neighborhood, what's been continued to grow in the space, where new houses have been being built, where things are being maintained, where neighbors are coming to continue to mow spaces, where people still are, there's traces of people, but nothing really quite happening as far as rebuilding in the same way that other parts of the city are. So this project I just kind of highlight as an example before diving into other aspects of my work in the Mongolia project, just to kind of give you an example of some of the ways that that I work as a photographer, and that I want to, or that I'm thinking about how I can use my images as a way to explore, explore issues such as the aftermath of a hurricane. Okay. Another thing that I want to highlight here before I dive into some more talk about the projects was some really important influences for me as a photographer, and for thinking about how influences for thinking about how I use photography as a tool to connect with and to talk about different communities and social issues. So as I mentioned before, I do a lot of research about South African landscape photography, but before I even started doing any of that, I studied and was really, really deeply influenced by South African documentary photographers who were working during the struggle period, so in the 10 to 15 years before the end of apartheid. This was a group of photographers who did all kinds of different work, not necessarily documentary work, but because things were so tumultuous in the country at the time, they kind of all got together and decided that they really needed to devote their work to exposing the injustices of what was happening. So these were photographers who concentrated on different altercations with the police, photographers who photographed kind of the daily injustices that the Black South Africans were enduring. So this was a series by David Goldblatt, who was photographing people who had to live outside of Johannesburg and were forced to take a bus for 3 hours in the morning to get to their place of work, and then who had to take that same bus back. And they would repeat this every day. So these images were really, really influential personally for me, because it gave me an idea, or it sort of inspired me about all the ways that photography and photographic series and documentary projects could tell stories, but also could bring attention to issues that maybe were falling a little bit by the wayside, or that that people just wouldn't have had any other way to learn about if they weren't inside the country, or didn't have access to the same populations. So seeing this work and encountering this made me really interested in documentary photography and thinking about photographic series again as this tool of engagement. And then at the same time, another really profound influence for me in thinking about how I use photography and how I think it can be an effective tool for engagement is the work of Martha Rossler, who many of you may know. She is a visual artist who works in video, photography, text installation, and performance, and whose work focuses on the public sphere and explores issues from everyday life and the media to architecture and the built environment, and a lot of things to do with war and national security. But this is the project that was most interesting and really challenged how I thought about how documentary photography could and should be used, was one called the Bowery to Inadequate Descriptive Systems. And these are just two quotations from her about that work, where she says, "The Bowery to Inadequate Descriptive Systems is a work of refusal. It is not a defiant anti-humanism. It is meant as an act of criticism. The text you're reading now runs on the parallel track of another descriptive system. There are no stolen images in this book. What could you learn from them that you don't already know?" And what this series is a series of diptych images in which Rossler photographs areas in the Bowery, kind of a Skid Row area, where there are a lot of people on the streets who were inebriated or who were suffering from poverty, who were not in the best states. And she put those together with a text panel with various euphemisms for drunk. And so what she does in this series is really ask you a very important question, which is that if you wanted to make a series about people who are down on their luck, who are on the streets, do you need to use their picture to get your point across? Like, what are you going to learn from depicting these people in the state on the street that you couldn't learn from just having a picture of the street and some words that represent that state right next to it? And there's a lot of really powerful things in her remarks and writing about this series. And she, at the time, this was a series that that she first exhibited in the 1970s, but it really challenged a lot of documentary photographers, both in that period and for many years after, to ask themselves about why they were why they were representing people in the way that they were, and to kind of ask themselves if they really needed to, if there was a way that they could be getting across the same point without making people bear the burden of their representation on behalf of the photographer. So I think this work is, again, this is something that I think about regularly today, especially in the work that I'm doing in communities where I'm not a part, what it means for me to be representing somebody else, what the purpose is, and whether it's necessary. So I wanted to go ahead and share this work with you, just kind of as a touch point that's profoundly impacted the work that I'm doing. Okay, so now I want to kind of transition to talk to you a little bit about some of the other projects I'm doing before diving back into the Mongolia work. So one of the things that I've always tried to think a lot about in projects that I'm doing, both currently and like in the past and as well as in the future, is what my role is as a photographer, and what is the best way that I can be using tools that I have to engage with a set of issues. And so one of the ways that I want to talk about that process is through a series that I started to do when I was living in North Dakota. So I moved to North Dakota in 2013, and that was a period of time a few years after one of the biggest oil booms that had ever happened in that state. This is a diagram a board that a colleague and a collaborator of mine in landscape architecture made to represent the density of wells in the Bakken region of North Dakota. So just to kind of give you an idea, so here's Fargo, and here's kind of that Bakken oil region. And all of these little red dots here represent new wells that were put in beginning in 2009, continuing up through 2016. So this was a period of profound change to a region that hadn't really seen a large influx of people, a huge reshaping of industry. It was primarily a farming community, and it was a very, very tumultuous time. So just to kind of give you an idea of how communities in this area were changing. So these are some representations of towns and just how their footprints changed in just a few years. So this is Epping, North Dakota, which is in not too far outside of Williston. But you can see how that changed in between 2010 and 2014. And then Watford City, which was a town of about 10,000 people at the start of the boom, and in 1995, how it grew from 2010 all the way up to 2014. So these were places that in a very short period of time were radically shifting right before the eyes of residents. And so this was an area that I got very interested in, living in the state and being at a university that benefited from a lot of the development in this area, but was very much apart from it. And so one of the things that I started doing when I lived there was to start driving out there and photographing and thinking about specifically how was the landscape changing in response to this rapid social shifts that were happening. So in this period, I was concentrating on photographing evidence of all of this change, of the newcomers that were coming in, of new developments in the industry, and that led me to focus a new project on pipelines in the region. Because one of the things that was starting to happen with all the new development and all the new wells was that there was a huge influx in construction of pipelines. And it seemed that every community and all the farmers and landowners that I was speaking with when I was out there were being impacted by this development. And this was happening at a really, really rapid rate. And this was around the time that the larger pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline, that many of you might be familiar with, was being planned and developed. And this was of course, a really big issue. The planning of this, the route of the pipeline, the changing parts of the pipeline, where it touched in the state and throughout the region. And it was an issue that drew national attention once the protests started happening from the Standing Rock Sioux. So again, I'm sure many of you remember hearing about these protests. Just to kind of show you, this was a breakdown of where the pipeline route goes and its relationship to the reservation. So once the protests started happening in 2016, and the camp was growing, and people were coming from all over the country to express solidarity with the Standing Rock Sioux and to support the litigation efforts to address the concerns over the pipeline. And it was a really, really profoundly impactful time to be in and around North Dakota. But for me as a photographer and somebody who was engaged in doing work about the oil producing region and who was interested in this pipeline, I wanted to dive into this issue a little bit deeper. And so I went to the camps, and I was there as a supporter, but it wasn't a time for me to be working as a photographer in the same way. And I say this because it was a situation and a story that was very much not one that I had a lot of connection to, that I had a lot of authority to represent. As an outsider, as someone who had very little knowledge about the issues that were surrounding this particular issue that was coming up for the pipeline. And so it was something that I chose to engage with, but recognized that it wasn't really my role to be depicting it as a documentary photographer and as somebody who is, even as somebody who was doing a long-term project about oil in the region. And so what I did instead was to connect with other photographers who were doing this. And so these are just two examples of Native photographers who were working at the camps and who put together incredible documentary projects about what that experience was like, and have continued to maintain ties to the communities that are working and continuing to work on this issue. Okay. But yeah, but I was still very, very interested in this massive pipeline. And specifically because, as I told you, I grew up in New Hampshire, and in New Hampshire, we just don't have big, massive construction projects that happen that we see or that we have a connection to. So, so I was in a situation where pretty much my whole life, I've benefited from resources that are coming from parts of the country that I never see, or that I never have any connection to, and that are just kind of out of the sphere in which I'm moving. And so the more and more that I learned about this pipeline, about the region, and about the ways that a landscape was being totally transformed over what was actually a very, very short period of time, the more I became interested in learning about the pipeline, and specifically about the path that it took across the 4 Midwestern states, from North Dakota, South Dakota, across Iowa and Illinois. And so, so I decided that what I would do is no longer just focus on North Dakota and the Bakken region, but to trace this path across the 4 states and see what this pipeline looked like at the ground level. And what I wanted to do was to use my landscape photographs as a way to talk about the shifts that were happening in the land, talk about the shifts that were happening in the community, and to really just ask myself, this very simple question, which was, what did it mean to put this kind of a massive project over such a great area, and what were the impacts of that over time? So, so I started photographing right around the time that the pipeline was being constructed. So at first I was mostly working in North Dakota and photographing pipeline construction there, and photographing the areas that were adjacent to the pipeline, and particularly the areas that were very close to other like farms or other areas of national importance. And I became interested in the ways that like little signs were forming throughout the landscape. So the little pipeline markers that would tell you where the path of this went. I became really interested in some of the effects of the construction. So for some of the residents, specifically, they were living around the areas that were by the primary path of this pipeline. I was part of a group that was doing some sociological surveys and talking with residents about their experience and concerns they had about the development in the area. And one of the things they said was that the dust was a huge problem for them. And it was interesting for me because that was something I had never really thought about being a big issue. But for these residents, it really was. So driving along the pipeline path too, it was even though I was mostly focusing on landscapes, I was also very interested in photographing communities around there, and different ways of different cultures that were still animating the place. This kind of a construction project involves huge numbers of people, especially at the beginning. And as I was showing you before, a lot of these communities in North Dakota really didn't have the footprints to totally accommodate all of the influx of visitors. And so as you drove along this route, you started to see these whole settlements of people that were put up just very quickly. And yeah, as I progressed throughout the state, I saw this pipeline at different stages of construction. And some places it had already been in the ground, and other places it was just getting put in. And again, the closer that I got to the camps where the Standing Rock Sioux protests were happening, there were more and more signs of conflict that were happening. So we started to see little bits of barbed wire that were coming up that would prevent, or that were meant to prevent people from interfering with construction. But yeah, so this project, again, it was something I was starting to work on pretty much all the time in 2016. Every time that I could get a little bit of a weekend away to go and photograph and just drive along this area and to cover as much ground as I could and really see what was happening, what was changing along this route. Where were the new interfaces between communities and this pipeline showing up? And it was a very, very long process to drive that many miles. So the Dakota Access Pipeline is about 1,200 miles as it extends throughout the states, and it's in some pretty rural areas, but it was really interesting to see just how things started to change as you moved in along this route. And this is a project that again, I'm still working on, and something that I've been working on, photographing different areas and returning to different areas over the past 2 summers. And one of the things that I've been doing more recently is to photograph with a drone, to photograph the shadows of where the pipeline has been constructed and now covered up, but where you can still see kind of the shadow of its presence in the land. And for me, working with aerial imagery of the pipeline is a really interesting way to talk about the ways in which something like this, even though it has this kind of big impact when it's being put into the ground, and there's lots of earth moving around and a lot of radical changes that are happening at the time of construction, is that it continues to impact people and their land and their fields and their communities, even many years afterwards. But yeah, so this is a project that, again, that's still ongoing. But for me, again, I wanted to bring it up and to talk about it here in this presentation, because it was an example for me of identifying an issue that I really cared about, but that I had to kind of say, well, what can I bring to this, and what's my role in representing this set of issues? And my role really was to ask the question about what does this look like? Because again, as someone who doesn't live in this area and who is using the resources that are generated, that are being transported along this pipeline, I really felt like I had a responsibility to engage with it, but in a way that was putting the question that I could ask first. So with that, we'll travel halfway around the world to talk a little bit about the project that is on campus, and another long-term project that I care very, very deeply about. So the project that is on campus is an examination of the city of Ulaanbaatar and the surrounding rural areas of in Mongolia, so kind of right the central area of the country. This was a project that I started first in 2007 when I traveled to Mongolia for the first time. And I was traveling there for work, and I decided that I really wanted to do a project about the city, because I had known virtually nothing about Mongolia before I went there. Mongolia is a very large country. It is the most sparsely populated country in the world. Mongolia has about 3 million people in it, which is smaller than most American states, and it's certainly on par with some of our major cities. So it's a very, very diverse country in that it's got deserts, grasslands, these really, really rich rural areas, but then really has one primary capital, which is Ulaanbaatar, where most of the population is living. And so I was going to a place that was very, very profoundly different from anything that I knew. And I was really interested to talk about what was happening in the city, and what was it like to be there at a time when a lot of things were changing. So I went there in 2007, and then I returned there in 2017. And when I returned there in 2017, I wanted to kind of return to some of the areas that I had been photographing in the city, in Ulaanbaatar, but also to expand out and photograph in different areas of the country, because I had a little bit more mobility than the first time that I was there. But Mongolia is a really a fascinating place, and it's something, you know, again, as I said, well, I don't think most people have had a chance to experience or really learn or think about what Mongolia is like, what the capital city is like, or the Mongolian people are like. And so when I went there, I wanted to, again, talk about some of these things, and I was really conscious of the fact that there was a lot that I needed to learn about the city and about the culture that I was immersing myself in. And so what I wanted to do was to do kind of a street photography project. And the goal of the street photography project was to start out and sort of say that I have everything to learn about this place. And so what I'm going to do when I photograph is to walk around the city and spend hours every day traveling and walking around different parts of the city and photograph the things that I'm seeing there. But I'm not going to try to photograph just things that look different to me or things that stand out as being, you know, something that is very unlike where I come from, but really just try to pay attention to how people are moving in space, the way that things are laid out in the city, and to just try to get a sense of what was happening before me. So this was a project that, you know, again, that I was doing, walking throughout the city and really just trying to pay attention and reminding myself that, again, like I was picking up on lots of things just by being a foreigner in a new place, but really that I had everything to learn from everything that I was seeing, and that I needed to be just paying attention and using that spirit of inquiry to guide what I was photographing. So Mongolia, for those of you who don't know, used to be part of the USSR, and in 1992, at the collapse of the Soviet Union, transitioned very rapidly into a democratic country, and very rapidly from a communist system to participating in a capitalist market economy. And that meant that there was a lot of very profound changes that happened in a very short period of time for Mongolians, and specifically how they lived and worked. And so one of the things that happened was that there was a tremendous growth in the population of the main capital city. And there was a lot of growth in various industries, and a lot of construction, and a lot of activity that was aimed at growing and building the national economy. And so when I was there in 2007, that was still a trend that was very much apparent. Whenever you were driving around or walking around, it felt like there was just a busyness, and there was a hecticness that was happening in the city that was very different. It felt very different to me than other cities I had been in. And I was really interested in that, and wanted to really try to capture that with the project. Another thing is that the Mongolia, just as a population, is very young. So even right now, about 36% of Mongolians are under the age of 18, which is a really tremendously young, or big percentage of the population to be quite so young. So I was interested in the way that youth were moving and behaving and energizing the city that was around. So the other thing that I wanted to do with this project was to photograph in black and white. And photographing in black and white was important for me because it was a way to talk about different parts of the city and different parts of areas, rural areas that were outside of the city, and have a way to kind of bring them all together in a big project that talked very that talked about a lot of different spaces and people and aspects of the country without making it seem like it was taken in totally different times. So by focusing on and using black and white photography, that was one way that I was able to do that. But yeah, so in 2007, I was photographing and doing this project and just generating tons and tons of imagery. And when I got back, I went through through those photographs, and it was just really, really excited about what I was seeing and about all the things that I had been able to witness and while I was there in the city. And I decided that I definitely wanted to go back and to continue this project with an eye to thinking about how the city was continuing to grow and change during a time that was full of lots of change for different developing economies throughout the world. And so in 2007, that's what I did. Or excuse me, 2017. I had the chance to go back to Ulaanbaatar and to drive a little bit further into the country. And so what I did was to still photograph in black and white and to still kind of follow some of the same routes that I had before, just to kind of maintain some consistency in what I was photographing. In addition to that, I decided that I really wanted to also bring some new elements into the project. And specifically, I was interested in doing a little bit more directly with residents. So most of the work that I had been doing before was photographing, again, this city, people living in the city, people moving throughout the city, trying to represent a sense of what it was like to be in that space. And so I wanted to, this time around, to photograph and to engage a little bit more with some of the residents. And so the way that I decided to do that was by setting up a photography booth in the main central square area. And what I did was that I was working together with some Mongolians who were with me when I was photographing, and we were meeting people that were passing through the square and asking if they'd be willing to participate in the project and if they'd be willing to have their picture taken. I didn't give them a ton of direction as to how I wanted them to stand or what I wanted them to do, and I really just kind of framed it as that this was a chance for that we were making a picture together, and that they could be as much a director in the representation as I was. And so, so I would take a series of photographs and share it with them. I also had a Polaroid camera with me, so I was taking pictures that I could hand and give to the people that participated. And it was a really interesting way to kind of extend the project and to think about maybe what I wasn't doing as much with the black and white photographs, where I was trying to represent the city as a space of change and as a space of energy and dynamism. And I wasn't really focused so much on single individuals as much as I was on the space. And by adding these photographs where things are slowed down, where we're really just focusing on a single person in the space, I had more of an opportunity to represent a part of the city that I wasn't able to do with the earlier work. And when I think back, again, to some of the influences and some of the work that I mentioned, like Martha Rossler's work at the beginning of the series, or excuse me, of the presentation, I think something like this was a little bit, was different for me because it was a chance to ask people how they wanted to be represented, to give them an opportunity to present themselves, to choose to be in my photographs, to choose to have my photographs participate in an art exhibition, and to choose to have their role be, or to take part in the whole series, to take part in the series as a whole. So it was a really exciting new chapter for me in the whole project, and something that again gave me a way to tap into an aspect of the profile of the space that I hadn't really been able to before. So I'm gonna kind of wrap down so that we can talk about any questions that you might have, but just in closing, I just want to again say that I'm really excited to be here and to have a chance to talk a little bit about my work and about some of the ways that I've tried to think always about how I can combine both a sense of obligation I feel to use my work to talk about things that are relevant to communities and to areas that are, you know, maybe perhaps very different from the place that I come from, but that I'm always trying to think in the creation of these projects and how I edit and how I present them about what it is that I have the authority to say and what it is that I can do effectively as a photographer. And with that, I'll take any questions that you guys have. And we'll jump back to a picture so we can see it.
Feel free to ask a question if you have one, or you can also drop it in the chat if you have a question.
I have a question. About your Mongolian project, did people seem receptive to being involved with it? Like, it sounded to me like you set up a booth and like, hey, if you would like to come participate. Were people like, yeah, sure, I'll do it? Or was there a lot of like, I don't know you, I'm not sure if I would like to be involved with this?
Yeah, well, you know, there was definitely a little mix of both. I mean, I think it was sort of a weird thing to do in the square because it was just like setting up the photographic lights, and I didn't have like a, you know, sign or anything. So I think people didn't necessarily know what I was doing until they got close enough to see what it was. But yeah, for the most part, people were really interested in it. I think that they became more interested in it the more they realized they, you know, could kind of have a role in playing with the with creating the picture. So like I say, when I would photograph people, I'd ask if it would be okay. I just tried a little bit about the project and what I was doing and what I wanted to do with the photographs and why I wanted to be photographing there specifically and was interested in their participation. And then we would take some images, I'd share them with them, and then they'd have some questions about more about the photographs and about what they could do. And so then it became kind of a fun dialogue. So it never really was like just saying, oh, okay, well, why don't you come stand over here and we'll interact for a minute or two, and then everybody just kind of goes on their way. So I think that by kind of creating this whole setup where we could have this back and forth exchange, it made people a little bit more excited about it. So it was really different than, say, with the street photography work where, you're moving throughout a space, and so you're never really stopping to, kind of set up a picture or to talk to people about what you're doing or to share what it is that you just photographed. So it was pretty different in that regard. But yeah, most people were really excited about it. And people who were just wanted to know what I was doing, came over and talked to me, and lots of people who were just interested didn't want to participate, and that was fine. But we still had a good conversation about the project and why I was there. So yeah.
Cool, thank you.
We have a question in the chat, Megan. It says, would you please talk a bit more about the importance of ensuring your subjects have full agency and how their lives are represented? This idea of agency is not always apparent to privileged populations.
Yeah, that's a really important question. Thank you for asking that. I really appreciate that. Yeah, so I think, again, the way that I think about agency in relationship to the Mongolia project was, first of all, trying to ask, anytime I was photographing people or a space with people in it, trying to ask, what was the goal of representing the people that I was representing? Why was I including them? What was kind of to come from that? And so in doing that, I was really trying to think about what the role of people in the photographs, for any purpose was. But with the portrait specifically, one of the ways that I really wanted to have to emphasize the agency of the subject in the color portraits was to create this kind of a setup where a subject could be choosing how they presented themselves, where they could look directly at the camera, or choose not to, where they could say that they either didn't like the photograph or they really liked the photograph for whatever reason, and they were almost directing me as much as I was doing anything to direct them. Another thing that was really important specifically for the portraits was that I had a conversation with the subjects about how the images would be used. Because they were going to be big portraits where it was very clear who was being represented. The whole focus was on them as an individual. It wasn't necessarily about them in relationship to the space that, or the city backdrop. And so, so with that being the case, I wanted them to know that this was, that I was an artist and I was interested in exhibiting this work, and it would, and exhibiting it in a place where it would be very, very far away from where they were. And so, so that had that kind of a conversation that we were able to have about the purpose of the work and where it was going and what it would end up to be was one that was really that I wanted to have for the purposes of making sure that the subjects felt like they were active agents in the work, that they were almost collaborators as much as a subject in a photograph. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to also, be sure to show that when I was photographing people that, that I was positioning them in the frame in a way that they just had a lot of visual weight too. So most of the photographs, or excuse me, all the photographs that I have of the portraits, people's, the subjects are kind of weighted upwards in the frame, right? So that when we're looking on them, they're almost kind of looming over us, right? So they have a little bit more visual weight than some of, say, the images where we're taking pictures of people moving on the street, where we're sort of looking from a wider vantage point, and we're on kind of more or less the same eye level. With these photographs, when you see them in person, it's almost like you're engaging with someone that's just right in front of you. So by thinking about representing people and using color photography to do it in this way, I really wanted the subjects just to have more weight in the whole process and the final image itself.
I have another question in the chat. I think you touched on it. Was curious about if the folks you photographed received copies of the portraits. I think you mentioned having a what do you call it? I'm drawing a blank.
Yeah, the Polaroid.
Polaroid. There you go. And whether you're still in contact with them. Also, Lisa wanted to know, having spent some time with these photos or images, being on campus, them here on campus, she's interested in how you decided on the scale of the works. Although they're technically smaller than life size, they each feel larger than life in person, and she loved the effect, and she's curious about that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. So the first question, yes. So the people that participated, we took Polaroids so I could give them something that they could leave with right away. I also created, when I was there, like an open Facebook event group, so that people who wanted to have access to the files could go in and download the pictures of themselves if they wanted them. So most people were really excited to be able to have that opportunity to access both a physical copy of the picture, but then also to get a digital copy as well. But yeah, so the scale of these is purposely larger than some of the black and white works that I was doing, and it's for the reason, Lisa, that you're identifying, which is that I want them to feel a little larger than life, even though they're not actually like the size of a history painting or something. But when you look at a work that is a little bit, beyond that 11 by 14 scale that that we see so many smaller photographs in. When you see something that's like a 20 by 30 inch print, you start to and you approach it, you're reading it as much with your body as you are with your eyes. And so you're very aware of your own presence in relationship to the size of the object that's in front of you. It's one of the things that I get most excited or jealous about sculptors for being able to kind of always engage this bodily experience of the viewer. And that's something that in photography photography we really have the most opportunity to do when we're working large scale, and we invite the viewer to come closer and to feel themselves like enveloped in a view or an encounter with a person or a scene in ways that maybe they wouldn't if they weren't seeing something in person like that or at that scale. So yeah, it's very purposely. I really wanted those to be big, and if I could have made them double the size, I probably would have.
Any other questions? We have another one here in the chat. What was it like setting up the trip to Mongolia where there are unforeseen complications you wish you'd known about? Did you have a contact who suggested places to visit or some point of interest? Were you somewhat knowledgeable of their language and culture, or was it an entirely new experience? If so, what was it like learning a new culture?
Yeah, no, that's a really excellent question. Working in Mongolia was a totally different experience from any other place that I had worked previously, and mostly because I really didn't know. I hadn't known a lot about Mongolia before I went there, or rather before I was preparing to go there. And the language is very difficult. So I did know enough language to be polite and to to introduce myself and to explain who I was and what I was doing, and to communicate on a very, very basic level. But yeah, most of the preparations that I was doing was reading, because again, I was really interested in the profound changes that Mongolia had gone through in such a short period of time, and how those had radically reshaped both the urban and the rural settings in Mongolia. So really, I was just reading a lot of books about the Mongolian economy and about all the things that had kind of changed during this transition from being a communist to a democratic nation. And so when I got there, I didn't have a ton of contacts. I had a couple people that I was getting in touch with who kind of helped me get in touch with some other people. And I will say that everybody that I met in Mongolia was just incredibly generous and kind, and was really, really very, very open and inviting to have me come over to their house, or to come to a gathering, or to travel out to the countryside to see an area that they grew up in. And it was, I was very fortunate to be put in touch with a lot of people that were just very kind and generous, especially with their time. So I as far as like places to visit and stuff like that, there were some things that I read about ahead of time, but really I was primarily doing a lot of research about the history of the city and about what had been happening in recent years that was shaping what I was seeing before me. But I mean, sorry, one other quick thing I'll say about it is that most of the time when people are coming to Mongolia, if they're lucky enough to do so, a lot of times they're landing in the capital city, and then they're leaving almost immediately to go out to the desert, or to do various kind of overland trips, or to do things with falcon training, or just there's a whole bunch of different reasons that people will come to Mongolia, but almost none of them are coming just to spend time in the capital city. So there's a perception that the city is a very kind of dirty, busy place, but it's also where all the people live. So in many ways, people told me places I should go, but I really spent most of my time just trying to get to know the city, and by making myself go on just really kind of really felt epic to me, of epic walks throughout different neighborhoods, just to really see how different it was in different spaces.
I'll ask one final question. You mentioned several times about the authority to represent, and I'm wondering, when did you know to pull back, or to shift gears, or I'm going beyond what I feel like my authority is as an artist? And especially when you talked about the Dakota pipeline, where you shifted gears and it felt like this is something I can do and still appropriately represent. So when do you know when to shift or refocus?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that yeah, that I kind of am constantly thinking about in really any project that I'm working in. But I'd say it's just kind of that moment when you start to feel like you're making decisions about what you're representing and how you're organizing things in your frame that are about a story that you want to tell. So like for me, with the Dakota Access pipeline, the story that I started to, the things that brought me and kind of connected me to that set of issues was really about the development of the oil boom, right? So that was kind of the issue that I was interested in, and then that was work that I was doing again before the protest started, and then once that happened, it became such a really really important part of that story. But when I went to the camps and was there, it just felt like all the photographing I was doing was just me trying to document something that was happening before me that I felt like I should, because it fit in with the story about what oil was in the state. But I just didn't feel like I would, it was like when I was there in the camps, like I didn't really have any connection to the people that were there. I mean, I knew something obviously about the issue and about the Standing Rock Sioux, but that was just one small fraction of what was happening there. And it was just like the more that I was there and was talking to different people, I just sort of became confronted with the fact that I really had no idea what the depth of what was really going on. And so if I was to be doing that honestly, there was so much I had to learn before I was really going to be able to take a picture, a camera to it. And so it was just something that I decided just to back off from. And actually, when I show the Dakota Access work today, I don't really include anything from the Standing Rock protests. Like I'll usually obviously talk about it, but even the images that I have that I included here, they're really just kind of reference shots for me that I would never pretend like they were representative of that really historic event. So yeah, I mean, I think that the broader question that you're asking is, kind of when do you know, or when do you start to feel that? And I guess for me, like, and also in, the Mongolia project as well, it's really just, I start to feel that way and start to pull back once I feel like I'm starting to tell or bring in aspects of the narrative that I just don't have the full information on, or that I don't have a good reason for telling, that I don't, that's getting me too far away from the question that I start out with. And again, like as much as possible, I try to frame my own position in the question that I'm asking. So in Mongolia, I was really asking, what is happening in this city? This is an incredible place that's seeing rapid change. What does that change look like? What does that change look like to an outsider specifically? And so as long as I'm kind of maintaining that question where I'm positioning my own subjectivity like right front and center of it, then I'm not going to get too far away from that really fine line of not trying to tell a story that isn't mine to tell. That's something, again, I'm giving you examples of how I'm trying to think about it in these two projects, but I'm really I spent kind of my whole engagement or professional careers in working in photography, grappling with that question. And it's one that I can't ever really stop thinking about if I'm going to be honest in the work that I do. So again, I'm giving you examples of how I've thought about it in these two projects, but it's something that has to be front and center of everything that I'm doing, and something that I have to kind of continually reflect on. It's sort of that, why am I doing this, and what's the purpose? Is it really, is this a story that I'm the one that's supposed to tell this? Am I using on the skill sets that I have to, in a way that's productive, or am I just doing something because I can? And that's often led me to some difficult places in my work, and but it's at the heart of being a responsible artist, and so it's a career-long commitment to really challenge myself to think about those questions.
It's a perfect segue to conclude, especially for the students out there who are doing project work or service work in communities. Or any aspect of even your professional career, if you're thinking about engineering or so on and so forth, of really, I love that you said, Megan, keeping that question, the why you're going into this community, or what you have to bring, or your intention in going in. I think that's an excellent summary of your talk today. So thank you so much for your time. Excellent, excellent presentation, and I learned a lot tonight. So thank you so much. I want to remind everyone that Megan will give a gallery talk on the installation on Saturday, and that'll be via Zoom at 5 p.m. And you can get more information on the Rozsa website. And the installation will be up until November 14th, I believe.
The installation in the gallery is up until November 14th, and starting Friday, we also have a self-guided tour you can take on campus that will take you to 5 different locations where you can see Meghan's photographs. We have works in the Rozsa, in Walker, in Pavlis, in the library, and in the CDI. So please come out and see us.
Thank you all for your time tonight, and have a good evening. Be safe and be well.